At the beginning of the 19th century, ordinary Americans were not necessarily deeply involved in the political system. This reflected a political culture that still expected that ordinary folks would defer to their social superiors. Indeed, the national political system was specifically designed to limit popular participation, since only the House of Representatives was directly elected. Power was generally delegated to a small political elite, with most state and local governments controlled by a few great families who ruled through factional alliances. What changes? Why did ordinary Americans suddenly become so much more involved in politics? The change began at the local and state level, as old patterns and habits of deference were progressively eroded. Ordinary citizens became increasingly aggressive in demanding political rights, and government responded by broadening the franchise. Most of the new Western states provided for universal white male suffrage in their constitutions, and over time, most of the older states followed suit as well. Old property restrictions on voting faded away, ensuring that more and more men could actually vote. At the same time, more state and local offices became elective rather than being appointed. This shift happens at the national level as well, with changes in how presidents were selected. Prior to this era, the electors who chose the president were typically appointed by state legislatures. But increasingly, states transferred this power directly to the voters, and by 1832, only South Carolina continued to use the old system. It was not just a question of people having access to the vote. The rise of mass participation in politics also reflected the fact that more people were interested in politics, that they wanted to participate in government, and thought it was relevant to their lives. In large part, this reflected fundamental economic changes. Before the rise of the market revolution, government had relatively little impact upon the lives of ordinary people. Most Americans were self-sufficient farmers who grew their own food and bought few manufactured goods. However, as more and more Americans were drawn into a market economy, they developed a personal interest in questions of public policy, such as protective tariffs, internal improvements, the availability of credit. The Panic of 1819 and the subsequent economic downturn heightened their interest and their concern and shook their faith in traditional political leaders. Ordinary Americans also became more engaged because they were better informed. Technical changes in publishing, such as the introduction of high-speed power presses, made it easier and cheaper to print newspapers, journals, and books. These information sources became readily available. Newspapers in particular provided not only information, but also opinions. They were typically highly partisan, sometimes proclaiming their political affiliations right on their masthead, and they helped to mobilize voters to support one party or the other. In the 1700s, political factionalism had been viewed as a corruption of true republicanism. However, by the 1820s, well-organized parties and professional politicians increasingly gained acceptance as normal parts of the political system. Politicians honed the art of popular appeal. They made electioneering into a form of entertainment, with campaign rallies featuring colorful speakers and free food. At a time when many Americans remained relatively isolated on their farms, politics became a welcome distraction from the humdrum monotony of rural life. It was in the context of these changes that Andrew Jackson became a national figure. The son of humble Scots-Irish immigrants, he had been raised in a log cabin on the South Carolina frontier. His father died less than a month before Jackson came into the world, and his mother and brothers died during the Revolution. Like many others, the young Jackson looked to the West for his opportunities. He moved to Tennessee and became deeply engaged in the political and military affairs of this new state, as well as becoming a very wealthy slaveholder. In 1796, he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives on a platform of Western expansion and an unwavering commitment to Jeffersonian principles of limited government. During the War of 1812, he came to national attention as a military hero, first commanding a successful campaign against the Red Stick Creeks in 1813, and then repelling a British effort to capture New Orleans. He enhanced his reputation after the war with his belligerent invasion of Spanish Florida, undertaken in an effort to stop the raiding of Seminole tribes. Jackson ran for the presidency in 1824, but lost in a controversial election. He had won a plurality of both the electoral and popular vote, but because he had not achieved a clear majority, the decision fell to the House of Representatives, which chose John Quincy Adams. Jackson and his followers were outraged, insisting that the selection of Adams had been the result of a corrupt bargain, which illustrated the control that a wealthy, privileged elite had over the government. By all accounts, Adams' presidency was not very successful. He was an ardent nationalist and a firm believer in Hamiltonian principles of a strong central government. He proposed an ambitious program that included federal expansion of the nation's transportation system and the creation of a national university. It became increasingly clear, however, that the era of good feelings was over and that a new political party system was emerging. Followers of Jackson created a highly effective political organization, calling themselves first the Democracy and then simply Democrats. They were easily able to block President Adams' initiatives, in part because Adams continued to believe in the old ideals of nonpartisanship and refused to develop an opposing party. In the election of 1828, Jackson and his political organization appealed directly to the new populist democratic sensibilities of the voters by characterizing his opponent as a, quote, degenerate elitist aristocrat, unquote. He argued that he would reform the government and return it to the people. Backed by a strong political machine and riding on a wave of populist support, Jackson easily won the presidency. He immediately began instituting some changes in the way the presidency was conducted. He made no effort to include members of the opposition in his government. There was a tradition, going back to Jefferson, of trying to bring the opposition into the fold, based upon this old concept of government that rejected partisanship and political parties. But Jackson had no such scruples, and he became the first president to openly espouse the idea that parties were a positive good. This was reflected in his use of the spoils system in appointing government officials. Prior to this, presidents had generally kept most of the officials appointed by the previous administration. But Jackson suggested that this led to the development of a permanent and corrupt government bureaucracy. He argued that rotation in office would check the development of this entrenched power. In pragmatic terms, this meant firing people whose loyalty to the current administration was in doubt and replacing them with party loyalists. It should also be noted that while Jackson's detractors highlighted his use of the spoils system, the turnover in government officials was still relatively low. It's estimated that throughout his 2 terms in office, he only replaced about 20% of the government bureaucracy. Jackson dramatically increased the authority of the presidency. He suggested that only the president was chosen by the entire nation, and thus he had a unique position as a tribune of the people. Previous presidents had used the veto power sparingly, usually only when they thought a law passed by Congress was unconstitutional. Jackson, however, used the veto vigorously to check not only measures he perceived as contrary to the Constitution, but also simply in cases where he believed a particular piece of legislation was bad policy. He similarly made it clear that he would not automatically obey the dictates of the Supreme Court in interpreting the Constitution, that the office of the presidency was co-equal with Congress and the judiciary. In his general philosophy, Jackson adhered to Jeffersonian principles of limited government. One of his key goals was to reduce federal spending to pay off the national debt, and indeed, during his second term, he succeeded in this project, with 1835 and 1836 being the only 2 years in American history where the federal government did not have a significant debt.